Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. I'm still kind of blown away by the response to our last episode on universal basic income.
Yeah, it was really great to see so many different perspectives on a topic that, touches so many different parts of our lives.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of insightful comments, our friend Micky brought up a really interesting point, I thought.
Oh, yeah.
He said that the success of UBI might actually depend, a lot, on how educated and how aware the population is. Something to think about, right? I'm definitely going to check out Micky's upcoming videos on his channel and see how he digs into that idea further.
Yeah, for sure. That's a point worth thinking about. An informed public is crucial for navigating, any big change in society.
Totally. But today we are diving into a topic that's equally complex and I think thought-provoking too. We're diving into a topic today that's both fascinating and a little bit unnerving. CRISPR gene editing. And you guys have really been digging deep, wondering if this technology could actually be used to edit the human genome. And that's even something we should be aiming for.
It really is a topic that gets people talking and debating, and for good reason. I mean, the idea that we might be able to rewrite our own blueprint is both exhilarating and, yeah, maybe a bit scary too.
I get that. It's like we've all seen those sci-fi movies where gene editing goes wrong and suddenly we have super soldiers or some kind of crazy genetic disaster. But on the flip side, could this technology be used for good? Could it actually be the key to curing diseases that have been around for centuries?
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely huge potential for medical advancements. Imagine wiping out genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's even before a child is born. That's powerful stuff.
It really is.
Yeah.
But then where's the line? If we can edit genes to prevent disease, what's stopping us from editing them to make people smarter, more athletic, or even change how they look? That feels like a slippery slope.
That's the big question, isn't it? The ethical side of human gene editing is massive. It's a conversation we need to have as a society before this technology is everywhere.
Totally agree. So for anyone just joining us for this deep dive, let's break down what CRISPR actually is and how it works.
So CRISPR is this revolutionary gene editing tool, and it was actually adapted from a natural defense system found in bacteria. You know how bacteria are constantly dealing with viruses?
Yeah, they're like little warriors.
Right. Well, they've developed this amazing way to store bits of viral DNA in their own genome. It's like their own genetic most wanted list.
Oh, so they keep a record of all the bad guys. That's pretty smart.
It is. And those stored snippets let them recognize and target invading viruses in the future. They basically have this built-in immune system that can zero in on specific threats.
Wow, that's amazing. So how did scientists figure out how to use this bacterial system for gene editing?
They realized that they could harness this system to actually target and cut DNA in any organism, not just bacteria. They essentially created a programmable system that uses this enzyme called Cas9. It's like a pair of molecular scissors.
So you change the guide RNA and Cas9 will basically target any DNA sequence you want.
Precisely. It's like having a word processor for the genome. You can find and replace specific genetic sequences with incredible accuracy.
That's mind-blowing. So does this mean that we could theoretically edit any gene in the human body?
Theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
But of course, it's more complicated in reality. Getting CRISPR to the right cells in the human body is still a huge challenge. And there's always that risk of what we call off-target edits, where Cas9 accidentally cuts the wrong sequence.
Right, because even a tiny mistake could have consequences we don't expect.
Exactly. That's why scientists are constantly working on ways to make CRISPR more accurate and efficient. And it's also why having ethical guidelines and safety protocols in place is absolutely crucial before we start using this technology on people.
We've talked about curing genetic diseases, but what about other uses, like could be used to enhance muscle growth or make people more intelligent?
Those are areas that are being researched, but that's where the ethical concerns become even more significant. The idea of using CRISPR to enhance human capabilities brings up a whole bunch of questions about what it means to be human and whether we should be messing with the very essence of who we are.
Yeah, like opening Pandora's box, right? Once we start down this path, who knows where it ends?
Exactly. That's why it's so important to have these conversations now while the technology is still relatively new. We need to decide, as a society, what limits we're going to set on gene editing, and how we'll make sure it's used responsibly.
So how do we even start dealing with these really complex questions?
Well, I think first, we need to understand that gene editing isn't black and white. There's this whole spectrum of potential applications, each with its own ethical baggage.
That makes sense. Using CRISPR to cure a terrible genetic disease feels very different from using it to make someone a better athlete or boost their IQ.
Right. And that's why it's so important to look beyond the hype and the fear-mongering and really have an honest conversation about the good and bad that could come from this technology. We have to ask ourselves, what are the possible downsides, even if they're unintended? Who's going to have access to these treatments? And who gets to decide which traits are considered desirable?
Those are heavy questions, and there are no easy answers. But I think we have to start asking them now before this technology gets so advanced that it runs away from us.
Absolutely. And it's not just on scientists and ethicists to figure this out. Everyone needs to be part of this conversation because ultimately these decisions are going to impact us all.
True. I mean, if we're talking about changing the human genome, that's not just a scientific issue, it's a human issue. It's about who we are, who we want to be, and what kind of future we're creating for ourselves and the generations to come.
Well put. And that brings up the really big question that everyone's been grappling with. Should we be using CRISPR to edit the human genome at all? Is this a line we should never cross?
That's a question that keeps me up at night, honestly. On one hand, the potential to reduce suffering and improve human health is incredible. But then there's that worry about unexpected consequences and the possibility of misuse.
I think that's a very valid concern, and it's something we need to approach carefully and with a lot of humility. We're talking about tinkering with the very building blocks of life here.
Another thing I'm curious about is how accessible this technology is. Like, how hard would it be to actually use CRISPR? Could someone set up a gene editing lab in their garage, for instance?
That's an interesting question, and it's becoming more and more relevant as CRISPR becomes more readily available. There are actually companies selling DIY CRISPR kits online.
Wait, really? You can buy CRISPR kits online?
It's true. There are definitely companies catering to the biohacking community, selling CRISPR kits and supplies to anyone who can get online.
So theoretically, someone could just order a kit and start playing around with gene editing in their basement.
Yeah, in theory they could. And that's both exciting and a little bit scary. It raises a lot of questions about safety and the potential for things to go wrong, but it also shows how science is becoming more democratized and how powerful tools are becoming more accessible.
It's like the Wild West of genetic engineering, isn't it? We've got this incredibly powerful tool, but we're still figuring out the rules.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights how much we need to have a serious public discussion about the ethical and societal implications of CRISPR.
Absolutely. We have to move past the simple narratives of utopia or doom and really dig into the complexities of this technology.
I couldn't agree more. CRISPR isn't a magic cure or a weapon of mass destruction. It's a powerful tool, capable of both great good and great harm. And it's our responsibility as a society to decide how we want to use it.
So what are your thoughts on all this? Do you think we should be using CRISPR to edit the human genome? What are your hopes and fears about this technology? Tell us what you think in the comments. We really want to hear your perspective.
We'll be going even deeper into this complex and fascinating topic in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be exploring the possible benefits and risks of human gene editing in much more detail. It's kind of wild to think how quickly CRISPR has gone from being this thing scientists were researching to something everyone's talking about, even in government hearings.
Yeah, it's really moved into the mainstream fast.
Yeah.
And it's not just theoretical anymore either. They're already doing clinical trials using CRISPR to treat diseases like sickle cell anemia and some cancers.
Exactly. And the results from those trials are looking pretty good. It's giving hope to people who didn't have a lot of options before.
That's amazing. But that makes those ethical questions even more pressing, doesn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
If we have the power to cure those diseases, how do we make sure everyone who needs those treatments can actually get them?
You're hitting on a really important point. One of the big worries is that CRISPR could actually make existing inequalities even worse. We have to make sure these treatments, these life-changing therapies, aren't just something for the wealthy.
Right. It's like with any new technology, it has the potential to do good, but only if it's developed and shared in a way that benefits everyone.
Absolutely. That's where those ethical guidelines and regulations we talked about become so important. We need to have those discussions now before this technology is so widespread that we can't control it.
You mentioned earlier that there are actually different types of CRISPR systems. Could you tell us more about that? Like, how do they differ and what are they each good for?
Sure. So the most well-known CRISPR system is the one that uses the Cas9 enzyme, but there are actually others that use different enzymes like Cas12. These different systems work a little differently, so they're good for different things. Some are better at making really precise edits, while others are better at deleting or inserting larger chunks of DNA.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Scientists can pick the CRISPR system that works best for what they're trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of what makes CRISPR so versatile and powerful. It's like having a whole toolbox of genetic engineering tools.
You know, listening to all this, I can't help but think about how this could impact future generations. If we start editing the human germline, those changes get passed down to our kids and their kids and so on. That's kind of a big deal.
It is. And that's why germline editing is probably the most controversial part of all this. The idea of changing the human gene pool in a way that could have unpredictable and maybe even irreversible consequences, that's something we have to be incredibly careful about.
And what about the long-term effects of gene editing? I mean, even if we can make precise edits today, how do we know what those changes might mean for a person's health 20, 30 years down the road?
That's a great question, and it's one that scientists are still trying to figure out. The truth is, we don't fully understand the long-term effects of gene editing. The human genome is super complex, and even small changes can have effects that we can't predict.
So it's not just about making sure the edits themselves are accurate. It's about understanding how those edits might affect a person throughout their life, and even across generations.
Exactly. And that's why it's crucial to move forward carefully and with humility. We need to admit that we don't have all the answers and that there are always risks when we're messing with genetics.
It's crazy to think that CRISPR came from a bacterial defense system. It's amazing how nature can inspire such groundbreaking technology, you know?
I know, right? It's a good reminder that we still have so much to learn from the natural world. Who knows what other amazing discoveries are out there just waiting to be found?
It's both exciting and humbling, isn't it?
Right.
We have this incredible power to change the very building blocks of life, but we're still only beginning to understand how it all works.
For sure. And we need to remember that with great power comes great responsibility. We have to use this technology wisely and ethically, knowing both the good and the bad that could come from it.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the potential benefits of CRISPR, but let's talk a little more about those potential risks. What are some things that could go wrong?
One of the biggest worries is that CRISPR might accidentally cut DNA in the wrong place. We call that off-target editing, and it can lead to unintended mutations, which could be harmful.
And those off-target edits, those mistakes, they could be passed on to future generations, and we're talking about editing the germline, right?
Exactly. That's why editing the germline is so controversial. The stakes are incredibly high because we could be making changes to the human gene pool that could have lasting effects.
What about the possibility of CRISPR being used for bad reasons? Like, could someone use it to create designer babies with enhanced abilities, or even bioweapons?
Those are definitely things that scientists and ethicists are concerned about. The potential for CRISPR to be used for bad things is real, and it's something we need to be prepared for.
So it's not just about making sure the technology itself is safe and effective. It's about making sure it's used for good and not for harm.
Precisely. We need scientists, ethicists, policymakers, and the public all working together to develop the right safeguards and regulations.
You know, something that I think gets overlooked in a lot of these discussions about CRISPR is that it's not just about humans. This technology could totally change a lot of areas of biology, like agriculture and conservation.
That's such a good point. CRISPR could help us develop crops that are more resistant to disease or drought, or even create new biofuels to help us move away from fossil fuels.
It could even help us save endangered species by editing their genes to make them more resilient to environmental changes.
The possibilities are pretty mind-blowing. But it's important to remember that CRISPR is just a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad.
So ultimately, it's up to us, as a society, to decide how we want to use this technology. We have to have those tough conversations about ethics, risks, and the future we want to create.
Couldn't agree more. CRISPR is a powerful tool with the potential to completely change the world as we know it. It's up to all of us to make sure we use it wisely.
You've been keeping up with all the latest CRISPR research. Are there any breakthroughs or areas that you find particularly exciting or maybe concerning?
One thing that I'm really interested in is the development of new CRISPR systems that are even more precise and efficient than the ones we have now. Scientists are always working to improve the technology and reduce the risk of those off-target edits.
Makes sense. The more precise and efficient it is, the safer and more effective it'll be.
Exactly. And there's also a lot of research being done on new ways to get CRISPR into specific cells in the body. That's a big challenge, especially when we're trying to treat diseases that affect lots of different organs or tissues.
So it's not just about making CRISPR itself better. It's about figuring out how to get it to the right place in the body to do its job.
Absolutely. And they're coming up with some really creative ways to do that, like using nanoparticles or viruses to deliver CRISPR to specific cells.
Wow, that's fascinating. Sounds like a lot of smart people are working on this.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's such a dynamic field. It's moving so fast, and it's exciting to see the new discoveries that are being made every day.
With all these incredible advancements, it's important to keep in mind that CRISPR isn't a magic solution.
You got it. It's not going to cure everything or solve all our problems, but it's a powerful tool that has the potential to really make a difference.
And it's a tool that comes with a lot of responsibility. We need to use it wisely and ethically, and be aware of both the good and the bad that could come from it.
That's a great way to put it.
It's amazing to think about how CRISPR has gone from this niche scientific thing to, like, front page news in just a few years.
Yeah, it really shows you how fast science can move and how a groundbreaking discovery can grab everyone's attention.
Right. It feels like there's a new CRISPR headline every other day. It's hard to keep up.
It is. But that's also what makes it so exciting to follow. There's this feeling of constant discovery and, what's possible. It's contagious. We need to be prepared for the possibility that CRISPR could be used for harmful purposes.
So it's not just about making sure the technology itself is safe. It's about making sure it's used for the right reasons.
Exactly. And that's going to take a lot of collaboration. Scientists, ethicists, policymakers, the public. Everyone needs to be involved to come up with the right safeguards and regulations.
One thing I think we often forget in these CRISPR conversations is that it's not all about humans. This technology could completely change other areas of biology, like agriculture and conservation, right?
Absolutely. CRISPR could help us create crops that are more resistant to diseases or better at surviving drought. Or we could create new biofuels that could help us move away from fossil fuels.
Wow, even helping to conserve endangered species by making them more resilient to climate change.
Exactly. The possibilities are really incredible. And just like any tool, it can be used for good or bad.
So at the end of the day, it's up to us to decide how we want to use this technology. We have to have those hard conversations about the ethics, the risks, and the kind of future we want to create. It seems like it makes sense to be super careful when it comes to changing the human germline.
Exactly. Germline edits can be inherited, which means they get passed down to future generations. So any unexpected consequences could have a ripple effect for generations to come.
Wow, that's something to think about. Finding the right balance is critical. It's definitely given us a lot to think about. But that's what the deep dive is all about, right?
Yeah.
We give you information and different perspectives so you can form your own opinions.
Exactly. We don't pretend to have all the answers, but we want to give our listeners the knowledge to participate in these discussions. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive, episode 2024, 1024, part 3 of 3.
So speaking of excitement, what have you been up to this week? Anything fun or interesting going on?
Actually, yeah. I finally finished building that backyard observatory. The one I was telling you about?
Oh, yeah. The one with the retractable roof.
That's the one.
That's incredible. You're living my childhood dream.
It's pretty amazing. To be able to look up at the stars with no light pollution gives you a whole new perspective.
I bet. The vastness of space is what we all need to realize, that our problems down here are pretty small.
That's a beautiful thought. It definitely puts things into perspective.
It does. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive for today. We covered a lot, from how gene editing works to the ethics of it all.
Yeah, we explored the potential for, big medical breakthroughs, the risks of unintended consequences, and just the huge implications of changing the human genome.
A huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this journey of discovery. Don't forget to check out Micky's channel for more of his thoughts on UBI. And keep those comments coming. We love hearing from you.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep looking up at the stars.
And remember, even if gene editing lets us design the perfect human someday, it'll never be able to copy a real belly laugh. So go out there and find something that makes you laugh today.